Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Adam Young. I'm a partner with Seyfarth Shaw's Workplace Safety and Environmental Group here in Chicago, Illinois. I focus my practice on occupational safety and health, the defense of OSHA inspections and citations, related labor and employment issues, and related civil litigation. I'm here to talk about gun violence and the Supreme Court's recent decision and what it means for employers as they try to address guns in the workplace, guns being carried by employees, and workplace violence more generally. It's not a surprise to anyone that firearms are prevalent in the United States. Of occupational fatalities, meaning the fatalities that occur to employees at work, 20% are caused by gunshot wounds. And in 2020, in terms of workplace violence numbers, there were 392 fatalities. So they're big numbers, they're affecting employers, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Injuries typically exceed fatalities by a power of 10 or 100 to 1, depending on the type of issue. The number of shootings and injuries varies widely by region in the United States. Some states in the South and Plains have the highest rates, while they're much lower in the Northeast and Hawaii. For instance, Louisiana's gun fatality rates are more than 5 times that of New Jersey. We've seen this issue arise most visibly recently in the almost weekly mass shooting tragedies that are affecting communities and workplaces across the country, one of which was most recently here in Highland Park, Illinois. So a lot of employers are focusing on this issue. How can they address it proactively? How can they protect their employees? And how can they reduce liabilities? The question raised is legally, what has changed? The Supreme Court has defined a right to possess and carry firearms. They weren't taking up Second Amendment cases and throwing out state laws until the early 21st century. So this is a new change in the law. And most recently, the Bruin decision in 2022, the Supreme Court declared New York's law that restricted carrying of weapons to be unconstitutional. It restricted who could get a concealed carry permit and how they could use those weapons. We don't anticipate there's going to be a lot of 60 vote in the Senate type support for significant gun legislation to come out of the federal government. Some states also have adopted red flag laws, and those laws allow the police, for example, in Illinois, if someone is arrested for criminal domestic violence misdemeanors, the police will go to their house and will take their guns and typically give them to a relative. Only 20 states and DC have any kind of red flag laws. In some states like Oklahoma, there are anti-red flag laws, which prohibit local communities or cities from enforcing any type of red flag law. And the red flag laws that exist typically address, mental incapacitation, threatening behavior, violent behavior, and things of that nature. So, what does this mean, these changes, for employers who do not want employees or visitors carrying guns in the workplace? In around 2010 and 2011, states began enacting a series of laws to prohibit employers from restricting firearms at work in certain ways. And what they were able to get support for was these parking lot and vehicle laws that employees could drive into work, leave a gun in the parking lot. Typically, they have to have it in an inoperable state, locked in the case or in the glove compartment, not with the ammunition, things of that nature. There's a lot of restrictions on how employees were allowed to have the parking lot guns, but the parking lot guns were allowed. And when legislators across the country tried to introduce bills that prohibited employers from disallowing guns in the workplace itself, so in the facilities, business groups largely intervened, and states did not pass those laws. So in every state that I'm familiar with, employers can restrict guns inside their workplace in their facilities. They're private facilities. They're operated by the employer or operated by another entity. Some of the states require signage, right, to enforce that prohibition. So that would let people know that they're not allowed to have guns in that facility. We think there's probably going to be some confusion relating to the Supreme Court's pronouncements, that individuals won't know. Nothing has changed with regard to whether they can carry a gun into ABC stores, right? Or whether they can bring a gun to their workplace. So in terms of that confusion, we think signage and retraining is very helpful because it reinforces that the policies are still existing as well. Another question we got is, what might this all mean for companies with facilities or remote employees in states with permissive gun carry laws? Again, they have more permissive gun carry laws. People are allowed to carry guns, but you're allowed as an employer to restrict it from your facilities themselves, so from the physical buildings. Remote employees is a little bit trickier, right? So employees do have the right to have guns in their own home. The employer can restrict its facilities. The employer can restrict its vehicles. So if an employee is going to be driving a company vehicle, you could say no guns are allowed in that vehicle. And when the employee is at a third party on company business, employees can restrict guns in that context too. Where the employer probably has less ability in these states to restrict guns is in people's homes. If they're working from home, we can't tell them they can't have guns in their own home in most of these states. And then if, the most gray area that's going to be dependent on state law is people driving their personal vehicles for company business. Typically, those parking lot laws, a lot of them can be read to allow individuals to have guns in their car and even drive on a company property with it. So unless like Minnesota, that specifically has a statute that says employers can restrict employees from carrying a gun at any time while they're on company business. It may be state specific, and we'd have to provide you more specific information. Some of the states that pass these parking lot laws have immunity provisions. Those expressly provide that employers who do not prohibit employees from carrying concealed weapons on the premises, they have immunity from liability arising from that decision. But it's unclear how far that immunity goes, because as we all know, there are a lot of different torts, right? Negligent hiring, negligent supervision, failure to train, those could all be potential, non-intentional torts that the employer could be sued for that aren't specifically from that decision to allow concealed weapons. And then second, if an employee is injured, that may be a workers' comp claim that would be brought. And then finally, my forte is OSHA. OSHA says that every employer has a general duty to protect employees from a recognized hazard that's likely to cause serious injury or death. Where employees have been shot dead at work, OSHA has issued general duty clause citations. And OSHA said you aren't doing enough to abate the risk or limit the hazard of individuals carrying guns at that workplace. So another question we received was, can an employer prohibit a remote employee from carrying a gun while on company business when the employer has consented to the employee working from a state with permissive gun laws? And again, the answer is yes and no. If they're working in their house, they're working out of their hotel room, it's different when it's than being in a company vehicle or on company business. And it is dependent somewhat on state law to the extent in which they can carry that gun. But I'm not aware of any state where an employee has an unfettered right to carry guns into clients or customers or things of that nature. And then finally, if that employee shoots someone while on company time or business, is the employer exposed to liability? Yes, absolutely. The employer is always going to be exposed to liability for its own torts. And I said a couple of those already: negligent hiring, negligent supervision. There's potential claims that could be brought in workers' comp. There's potential OSHA liability. And workplaces, are not immune from gun violence. Occupational gun violence comes in many forms, like all workplace violence. You have individuals with no connection to the workplace, like the random shootings. You have violent acts that are directed by a customer or a client. You have violent acts by a current or former employee directed at another employee. And then you have violent acts in the workplace, kind of a domestic situation that comes into the workplace. So spouses, paramours, relatives, things of that nature. Women are far more likely to be murdered at work by a partner or relative or spouse or something of that nature. Men are most likely to be murdered by the client customer, and that's in a robbery context. As I said, OSHA's general duty clause applies. It has no standard on gun violence, but it has provided a lot of recommendations and guidance as to what types of programs employers need to have in place. And that is a proactive workplace violence and gun violence prevention program. You need to address the risks, right? Prohibiting firearms in your workplace, if that's your preference. And a workplace violence policy. Typically, they'll have zero tolerance for all types of workplace violence, from things like threats and acts all the way to gun violence. Have response plans, early warning signs. And what OSHA typically is looking at is, well, what were you doing proactively ahead of time? Maybe you couldn't have stopped this actual incident, but you were getting reports that this person was unsettled. The employee made violent threats and you were terminating him, but you brought him in anyway and did the in-person termination. Failure to address these issues proactively is one of the greatest sources of liability for employers. So mishandled terminations or discipline, those can be done remotely if you have any question at all. Disgruntled former spouses or significant others, do you have security at the workplace? Have you provided a picture of that? Have you communicated with the police where appropriate? Tolerating weapons or illegal drugs on the work site is another failure to act proactively. In the retail context, overly zealous security personnel chasing robbers or thieves out of stores and down the street, that can be a big source of unintentional workplace violence. Security personnel needs to be trained on how to act appropriately. If you don't tolerate your security personnel from carrying firearms, you need to be absolutely clear about that, because if they're carrying and pulling firearms, they're far more likely to be seriously injured or killed. So we recommend having a plan in place. There's recommendations from OSHA on how to draft that plan. We're happy to provide you with any advice as you need going forward to address this issue.